I couldn't believe my eyes. The morning had started out perfect. I stood on my porch, cradling my coffee in both hands, watching as the golden rays of the rising sun stretched across my fields. The crisp scent of damp earth mixed with the cool breeze, and for once, everything felt just right. No phone calls, no problems, just me, my land, and the quiet hum of a new day. That peace didn't last long. At first, I barely noticed the slow approach of two black SUVs rolling up my driveway. They moved deliberately, creeping forward like predators staking out their prey. My driveway wasn't some public road, not part of any fancy suburban neighborhood. This was my land, bought fair and square, free from the bureaucratic nightmare of a homeowners association. I had made damn sure of that when I signed the papers. No HOA board meetings, no absurd fines, no nosy neighbors telling me how to run my farm. So why the hell were they here? As soon as I caught sight of the badges stamped across their chests, my stomach twisted into a knot. HOA Patrol. I tightened my grip on my coffee mug, barely resisting the urge to crush it in my hand. These weren't government officials. They weren't law enforcement. Just a bunch of self-important busybodies who had somehow convinced themselves they had power over people like me. One of the men, tall with a gut straining against his cheap polyester uniform, stepped out and adjusted his belt like he was some kind of sheriff. His expression carried the same smug superiority I'd seen on HOA enforcers before, the kind that said, "I have authority over you whether you like it or not." "Sir," he started, his voice dripping with forced politeness, "we're conducting a routine security check for the HOA. Just making sure everything is in compliance." Compliance. The word rang in my ears like a gunshot. Compliance with what? I wasn't in their damn HOA. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I wasn't about to let some wannabe lawman on a power trip push me around. The man stood there, waiting for me to react, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Instead, I squared my shoulders and met his gaze with an expression as cold as steel. "You're trespassing," I said flatly. "This is private property. You have no right to be here." The officer's smirk didn't falter. If anything, it deepened, like he had been expecting this reaction. He glanced at his partner, who was already moving toward my barn without so much as a word. My blood pressure spiked. I took a step forward, blocking his path. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" The second man barely acknowledged me. He just tapped the cheap radio on his belt and muttered something into it before turning his gaze back to me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "We received a complaint about unauthorized structures on the property. We're just taking a look." A complaint? From who? I wasn't even part of their damn HOA. Then it hit me. Debbie Whitman. That nosy, self-important woman who had the nerve to stop me at the grocery store a few weeks ago to complain about how my farm was ruining her backyard view. I had laughed at the time, told her she was free to move if she didn't like it. She hadn't laughed back. Instead, she'd given me a tight, passive-aggressive smile and said, "You really should take HOA rules more seriously, even if you're not officially part of the community." I had brushed it off as typical HOA nonsense, but now, standing in the middle of my own land while a bunch of HOA rent-a-cops trampled through it like they owned the place, I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. I clenched my fists, barely keeping my temper in check. "I don't know what kind of power trip you guys are on, but this is private property. You have zero authority here. Now turn around and leave before I call the sheriff." The officer chuckled. Actually chuckled like I had just told a joke. "You may not be part of the HOA," he said, like he was explaining something to a particularly slow child, "but this land borders the association's neighborhood. And according to HOA extended community regulations, any property within a certain radius still falls under our jurisdiction." Jurisdiction? Like hell it did. I looked past him and saw the other HOA enforcers fanning out, checking my fences, peering into my garage windows, one of them even snapping photos of my driveway. My jaw tightened. This wasn't a routine check. They weren't just here to poke around. They were looking for something. And then, my gut sank. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were setting me up. Before I could demand answers, one of the men strode up to me, holding a clipboard. "We're going to need you to sign this." I glanced down, and the moment I saw the words at the top of the page, I felt my entire body tense. Notice of compliance violation. I snatched the clipboard from his hands, scanning the list of infractions. Each one was more absurd than the last. Unauthorized fencing. Structures not meeting HOA aesthetic standards. Excessive noise from farm activities. Building materials and paint that do not comply with HOA-approved pallets. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. HOA-approved pallets? This was a farm, not a damn cookie-cutter suburban townhouse. "You have exactly 7 days to rectify these issues," the officer continued, clearly enjoying himself, "or you'll be facing escalating fines and possible legal action." Legal action? For what? Existing, I shook my head in disbelief, running a hand down my face. This was insanity. Failure to comply could result in a lien placed against my property. And that's when I realized what they were doing. This wasn't about regulations. It wasn't about community standards. This was about control. They wanted me gone. I didn't fit into their pristine little Stepford neighborhood aesthetic, so their solution was simple: harass me, fine me, intimidate me until I either caved or gave up and sold my land. I folded my arms, narrowing my eyes at the officer in front of me. "You do realize I'm not part of your little dictatorship, right? You have zero authority over my land." The smug bastard gave a mock sympathetic shrug. "The HOA board has determined that due to proximity, these regulations still apply. It's all in the bylaws." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to tilt his chin up to meet my glare. "You mean the bylaws I never agreed to? The bylaws that hold no legal weight outside of your neighborhood?" For the first time, his smirk faltered. Just for a second. That's when I knew they were bluffing. They were banking on intimidation. They thought if they made enough noise, if they threw around enough legalese, I'd fold. They seriously underestimated me. I took another step forward, lowering my voice to a calm, almost menacing level. "Let me make something crystal clear: you and your little HOA patrol have exactly 10 seconds to get off my land before I call the real cops and have you charged with trespassing." His jaw tightened. "Sir, there's no need for 1. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. 2. The other HOA officers exchanged nervous glances. 3. One of them actually took a step back. Finally, Rick scoffed and snatched the clipboard from my hands. "Fine," he spat. "But consider this your official warning." They turned and stalked back to their SUVs, but before they left, I saw one of them snap one last photo of my house. And that's when I knew, this wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, I was up before dawn, moving through my usual routine, feeding the livestock, checking the fences, making sure everything was in order. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't finished with me yet. They had left my property the day before, but not before snapping a few final pictures, like they were gathering evidence for something bigger. I didn't have to wait long to find out what. I was in the barn checking on the feed supply when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Not again. I wiped my hands on my jeans, already bracing myself for another pointless confrontation. But when I stepped outside, it wasn't the HOA's black SUVs this time. It was a county vehicle. A white truck with an official-looking logo on the side rolled to a stop near my front gate, and a man in a neatly pressed button-down climbed out, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. He had the same smug look I had come to recognize from HOA board members, the look of someone who believed they had power over me. "Morning," he greeted, strolling up as if he belonged here. "I'm Greg Albright with the County Zoning Board. We received a complaint about unpermitted agricultural activity on this property." I stared at him, my grip tightening around the rag in my hands. "Unpermitted? This farm has been in my family for generations." Greg hummed as if that was irrelevant, flipping through his papers. "Well, according to the complaint, there are multiple violations on site: excessive livestock noise, improper waste disposal, unauthorized structures." He raised an eyebrow at me. "I'm going to need to take a look around." I let out a slow breath, fighting the urge to laugh. Of course, the HOA couldn't enforce their nonsense directly, so now they were trying to weaponize bureaucracy against me. They had filed a formal complaint with the county, hoping to bog me down in endless inspections and legal red tape until I either folded or made a mistake they could use to shut me down for good. I crossed my arms. Who exactly filed this complaint? Greg hesitated. It was anonymous. Bingo. I forced a smile. "You mean the HOA filed it?" He blinked. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." His smirk wavered for a split second before he recovered, clearing his throat. "Regardless, I still need to conduct an inspection." I stepped in front of him. "Not without a warrant." Greg's confidence faltered. I had done my homework. Unless there was probable cause, and no, someone complained, wasn't probable cause, county inspectors couldn't just walk onto private property and start poking around. But they were counting on me not knowing that. "Listen," Greg sighed, shifting on his feet, "if you just cooperate, we can get this sorted out quickly. Refusing an inspection will only raise more questions." I gave him a slow, deliberate look. "Let me make something clear. You are not stepping foot on my land without legal justification. So either show me a warrant or get off my property." Greg's face turned stiff, but he knew he had nothing. With a frustrated sigh, he tucked his clipboard under his arm. "Fine. But expect a follow-up." I didn't say anything, just watched as he climbed back into his truck and drove off. But I knew this wasn't the end of it. Sure enough, later that afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. A formal notice from the county. Notice of zoning violation. I skimmed the document, feeling my blood pressure rise with every line. Unpermitted livestock enclosures. Failure to adhere to noise regulations. Improper disposal of agricultural waste. Structures not built to code. Every single one was a blatant lie. My livestock were within noise limits. My waste disposal was compliant and inspected annually. Every structure on my farm had permits on file. The HOA wasn't even pretending to play fair anymore. They were trying to bury me in legal red tape and financially drain me with fines and required hearings. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Early the next morning, Jake, Travis, came running toward me, his face pale. "Boss," he panted, holding up his phone. "You need to see this." I took the phone and frowned. It was an email, an official letter stamped and signed from the county's environmental department. Notice of environmental compliance investigation. I felt a rush of heat crawl up my neck as I scanned the document. A report had been filed claiming hazardous runoff from my livestock was contaminating the local water supply. Contaminating the water? I scoffed. That's complete bull. They sent an inspector, Jake interrupted. He's already here. I turned and saw another white truck pulling up my driveway. This was getting out of control. By the time I reached the gate, a man in slacks and a cheap button-down was stepping out, a clipboard in one hand, a badge clipped to his belt. He had the same slimy, smug look Greg had. "Afternoon," he greeted, flashing his badge. "I'm with the Environmental Compliance Board. We received reports of excessive nitrates in the local water supply, possibly from manure runoff." I folded my arms. "From who?" The inspector hesitated. "It was an anonymous complaint." I let out a bitter laugh. "Let me guess, the HOA filed it?" "I can't disclose that," he replied smoothly, but I already knew the answer. I took a slow step forward. "Tell me something. What do you think is contaminating the water?" He glanced at his clipboard. "Excessive nitrates." That's when I knew he hadn't done a single test. He was reading off a script. I shook my head, barely containing my anger. "My farm doesn't even run off into the local water supply. I have a fully compliant drainage system, certified, inspected. I have the paperwork to prove it." For the first time, his confidence faltered. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my phone. "Tell you what, let me call the county real quick to verify your credentials." The inspector froze. I took another step forward. "Matter of fact, why don't we call them together?" He backed up. "There's no need for that, sir. I'll follow up later." And then, just like that, he turned and practically ran back to his truck. I stood there, watching as the dust kicked up behind him as he sped away. The HOA had actually sent a fake inspector to try and scare me into compliance. I let out a slow breath. They weren't just harassing me. They were coming for my land. And if they thought I was just going to roll over, they were dead wrong. By the time the dust settled from the fake inspector's retreat, my pulse had steadied, but the fire in my chest was burning hotter than ever. The HOA wasn't just harassing me anymore, they were orchestrating an attack. Bureaucratic red tape, false violations, and now fake government officials. They were getting desperate. And that meant only one thing. They were planning something worse. I spent the rest of the day gathering my paperwork, cross-checking my permits, and making sure every inch of my farm was in compliance. Not that it wasn't already, but I knew how these types operated. They weren't looking for real violations. They were looking for anything they could twist into an excuse to hammer me harder. That night, I barely slept. Something told me the next move was coming soon, and I wasn't wrong. The next morning, just as I was heading out to feed the livestock, a county-certified letter was waiting in my mailbox. My stomach sank as I tore it open. Notice of intent to rezone, application pending review. I had to read it twice to believe it. The HOA had actually filed to have my land rezoned, without my knowledge, without my consent. If the county approved it, my farm would be redesignated as residential adjacent property, which meant all HOA regulations would suddenly apply to me. I clenched the letter so hard the paper crinkled in my fist. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. They were trying to force me out, legally. I stormed inside, slamming the letter down on my desk as I fired up my laptop. It didn't take me long to find the paperwork on the county website. Debbie Whitman, my lovely HOA Karen neighbor, had personally spearheaded the request. It got worse. The application included a letter of intent, an interest from a real estate development company to purchase my land once the rezoning was complete. The HOA wasn't just harassing me, they were actively selling my farm behind my back. My jaw clenched. I had had enough. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my truck, and drove straight to City Hall. By the time I got to the zoning department, I was practically vibrating with anger. I slammed the letter down in front of the clerk and demanded to know how the hell a third party had been allowed to submit an application to rezone my land. The clerk gave me a blank look before tapping at her keyboard. "The request is pending, but it hasn't been approved yet," she said, squinting at her screen. I exhaled, my fists tightening. "It's not going to be approved." She hesitated. "You might want to talk to the head of zoning enforcement. There's been a lot of talk about this case." That didn't sit right with me. I stormed down the hall to the zoning director's office, and the moment I walked in, I knew I was right to be suspicious. The man sitting behind the desk barely looked up from his monitor. His desk was cluttered with files, but right on top was a folder stamped with the HOA's letterhead. I gestured to the letter I had slammed onto his desk. Care to explain how my land is up for rezoning without my consent? He sighed, rubbing his temple like this was all a minor inconvenience to him. The HOA is a well-respected entity in the community, Mr. Carter. They claim your property is an ongoing concern for neighborhood aesthetics, and they've cited multiple complaints. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. Oh, I'm sure they have. He tapped the folder. They have documentation. So do I. I reached into my bag and dropped every piece of evidence I had collected onto his desk. Copies of my permits, my farm's zoning approval records, a printed log of all the fake complaints that had been filed against me in the last 2 weeks. His face twitched as he flipped through the papers. When he got to the security footage stills of HOA members sneaking onto my land, planting evidence, and the fake inspector running away, his expression completely changed. I leaned forward, my voice low and sharp. Now tell me, do you think I am the problem here? Silence. He swallowed hard, closing the folder. I may need to take a deeper look into this. I scoffed. You do that. And while you're at it, you might want to tell the HOA that their scheme just fell apart. I turned on my heel and walked out. But I wasn't done yet. If the HOA thought they could play dirty, they were about to see what real retaliation looked like. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done playing defense. The HOA had spent weeks trying to crush me with bureaucracy, harassment, and outright fraud. They thought they could intimidate me into submission, force me out of my own land, and hand it over to developers on a silver platter. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I stayed up until 3 a.m., compiling everything. Every fake violation notice, every security camera clip, every shady maneuver they had pulled. I dug through county records, legal loopholes, and HOA bylaws until I had a case so airtight that not even their sleaziest board member could wiggle out of it. Then, I took it public. I started with a Facebook post, laying out the entire saga in brutal detail. Within hours, it exploded. Neighbors, local business owners, even people from outside the county started commenting, furious at how the HOA had abused their power. I followed up with a Reddit thread, where people shared their own horror stories about HOA harassment. The engagement was unreal, hundreds of thousands of upvotes in less than a day. The real turning point came when a local news station picked up the story. Suddenly, the HOA board wasn't just dealing with me, they were dealing with public outrage. It got worse for them when the county finally stepped in. The illegal surveillance camera? Removed by city officials. The false zoning claims? Rejected outright. The fake environmental complaint? Under investigation for fraud. But the final nail in their coffin? The lawsuit. My lawyer didn't just go after them for harassment, he filed for defamation, invasion of privacy, and attempted fraud. By the time the dust settled, the HOA was a sinking ship. Board members resigned in disgrace, residents stopped paying their dues, and within weeks, the entire organization collapsed. One morning, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, Travis grinned at me from across the table. So, we won? I chuckled, looking out over my land, the same land they had tried so hard to take from me. Oh yeah. We won. But the real victory? Exposing their corruption for the world to see. The truth didn't just take them down, it made sure no HOA ever pulled the same stunt again. So, what about you? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.